Good evening, everybody. Hello, Pursh. How are you doing? Am I audible to everybody? Is everybody around? Am I audible? Tarveen? At the outset, I hope each one of you are doing well. Your families are doing well. Praise for everybody that God, as soon as possible, bestows back to our normalcy. We can meet, enjoy, and work together. At the outset, I must thank the organizers. If I was to name each one of them, probably my entire time would go there. So I am not doing that. Instead of thanking them right in the beginning for giving me this opportunity in these times of crisis to be amongst you. The COVID crisis, if I may say so, is not a thing that would happily or easily end with the lockdown, whether it ends on 3rd May or thereafter. The perennial curse of substandardizing and adulterating now in medicines, hand wash liquids, sanitizers, protective gears would rub salt to the injury. Few virus calls cells hidden in healthy bodies or surface protecting them can easily have a stage back, as most of them are predicting. After life, the question comes life and livelihood if I am not violating the copyright of the Honorable Prime Minister. The economic aftermath of the pandemic is real and cruel. We will, of course, have predictions from our economists and political strategists and show us a way forward. How do we go and handle the same? The Indian economy saw reforms way back in 1990-91, and several economic reforms were brought in. The enactment of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code in 2016 was a landmark legislative reform paving way for facilitating resolution process in corporate persons, limited partnerships, and individuals other than banks and financial sector. Insolvency and bankruptcy is going to play a big role post COVID-19, since the economic situation and the economy in the country had already started slowing down, may have a bigger hit, and many corporate persons may feel crunch of liquidity and NPS and are unable to pay their dues, financial or operational. I understand the Union Cabinet on 22nd of April 2020 has already cleared a proposal from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to suspend filing of insolvency petitions for the next 6 months via an amendment to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. Once enacted, we will have to look at the words of this said ordinance to interpret the same. Many have their views on this proposed ordinance, lenders and creditors during 6 months would not be entitled to invoke the insolvency proceedings or invoke the jurisdiction of the adjudicating authority, if that's the position that comes out of the news that has come forward so far. In any event, whatever will be the period of lockdown will have to be deducted or excluded from the period of insolvency timelines, whether with respect to corporate persons or the guarantors now brought into force from 1st December 2019. I intend to give you an overview of the Insolvency Code and will look for any more opportunities to come to you to specifics. On a lighter note, I must add that in the last 3.5 years of functioning of this code, it has been said that most of the eminent professionals, be it company secretaries or chartered accountants, senior counsels or counsels, have been found practicing in the NCA or adjudicating authority or the appellate authority or tribunal rather than going to the Honorable High Courts and the Honorable Supreme Court to do other matters. The reason is obvious. It was a new regime brought into the country. For the first time, we have seen an insolvency provisions brought into the code by the code in 2016 for the first time. Prior to that, a corporate person would only go for a winding up. A creditor would only file a creditor petition of winding up under the Companies Act. The Reserve Bank of India, in fact, after coming into force of the code, identified 12 big accounts in the country where non-NPAs were pending, a lot of bank dues were to be given, and therefore directed that insolvency proceedings be initiated against these 12, most of which have now come to an end. The question post-COVID-19, the insolvency resolution process would become more robust, and I'm sure new questions are going to come up, both in relation to corporate persons and individuals, which will require interpretation at the hands of the adjudicating authority as well as right up to the Supreme Court. Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, as we all know, was enacted in May 2016 after the committee headed by Mr. Vishwanathan had given his report along with a draft of objects and reasons and also a draft bill. Once it was introduced in the Parliament, the matter was referred to the Parliamentary Committee, which for the first time it was seen in 4 months, gave a report, and ultimately the Insolvency Code was passed in May 2016 and brought into operation in phases commencing from August 2016 till December 2016. The later part, on 24th of March 2020, in fact, brought in a new concept that is Section 4 of the Insolvency Code. The initial threshold, which was 1 lakh rupee, has been enhanced to ₹1 crore. Many have their reservations on this too, because these smaller creditors who may have to who are looking at insolvency to recover their dues immediately, may be outside the jurisdiction of this code. But this is only with respect to prospective and would only apply to such cases that are to be filed today or after the lockdown, and may even apply to those cases subject to the interpretation made by the adjudicating authority with respect to petitions that have been filed but were not admitted and Section 14 order of moratorium had not been passed. The Insolvency Code applies to corporate persons incorporated into the Companies Act or any other law for the time being in force. It also applies to limited partnerships and also individuals. The resolution process, so far as the corporate persons are concerned, is called CIRP under the code. For any corporate person, it is time bound for a maximum period of 330 days, 180 plus 90. And if no resolution is approved by the adjudicating authority within the meaning of Section 31, Section 33 follows, where you have to file, where in liquidation proceedings begin and a liquidation order is passed. Let me straightaway take you to the outline of this code. The code is divided in 5 parts. The first part is normal, which is title, applicability, and definition. I may add here that after the Reorganization Act of Jammu and Kashmir, this code now even applies to the 3 new union territories created under the New Organization Act. So it has extended its applicability even to what was earlier called the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Part 2 of this code deals with insolvency resolution and liquidation of the corporate persons. And part 3 deals with insolvency resolution and bankruptcy. So the word from liquidation has been changed to bankruptcy when it came to partnerships, individuals, or startups. Regulations under the 2 parts, part 2 and part 3, have been made, and I must inform this August gathering that I think the number of amendments to the statutes and the regulations which have been made over the period of time of over 3.5 years must be a record in itself. So far as part 3 is concerned, the same has been made operative only in respect of guarantors who have guaranteed the corporate debt to the financial institutions or to the operational creditors, and that is limited in its operation so far as part 3 is concerned. Part 4 and part 5, part 4 deals with how do we establish the insolvency institutions like adjudicating authority. Actually, they are appointed under the Companies Act and are given the jurisdiction to come and execute, or what we call exercise jurisdiction under this code. Part 5 is miscellaneous, what we normally have in the statutes, and deals with insolvency fund, deals with powers of the central government to pass orders and give directions, has agreement with foreign countries, but 2 aspects are important so far as part 5 is concerned. One is section 238, which provides that the code overrides any other provision of law for the taking in force. And then comes 11 annexures to the code by which it amends 11 different acts, right from Income Tax Act, Partnership Act, and many other statutory acts, Customs Act, Excise Act, to bring them at par with what we find as with respect to the object of the code. So the question that arises is, where is the need for doing this with respect to that? But the first need that was felt was that we did not have any law in this country by which we were allowing, or which would allow a corporate debtor who had either by circumstances or willful default of its own management had not been able to do so. So the question that was hanging around and it was quite some time that the government was thinking of doing so, but then they constituted the committee, as I said earlier, and this whole thing took speed, which we are now seeing in what speed we have been able to do so. In part 2 of the code, there are 7 chapters. Chapter 1 deals with its applicability to the corporate persons. Then comes from section 6 to section 31, which deals with the question of right from who can initiate the insolvency until the order is passed by the adjudicating authority under section 31 by approving a resolution plan. I will deal with them in little detail. The third is the liquidation. Third chapter deals with liquidation process. In those cases where we have not been able to get a plan approved, a liquidation order gets passed under section 33 and goes up to its dissolution of the corporate person under section 54. Chapter 4 of part 2 deals with the corporate insolvency resolution process, which is fast track, but is confined to those companies which don't have assets more than 1 crore and are not listed, etc. So it's for them, it is a fast track code, provides for it a special procedure with respect to them. Chapter 5 deals with voluntary liquidation by the corporate debtor. In other words, while in section 10 in part 2, a corporate debtor would come to the insolvency court or the adjudicating authority and state that I want a resolution process to start, while in chapter 5 it gets the right to ask for voluntary liquidation straight away without going into the process with respect to resolution or rehabilitation. The voluntary liquidation starts from section 59 but has certain provisions to be complied with as a condition precedent. The majority of the board of directors must file an affidavit undertaking and certifying that it is not to achieve any ulterior motive, and it has been necessitated for circumstances that they must spell out in that affidavit. They must also state the valuation of their assets of the company and must also file the audited balance sheet with respect to the same. 4 weeks thereafter, a right goes to the members of the said corporate debtor, who must pass a resolution authorizing the board to go and move the insolvency board or the adjudicating authority, NCLT, for asking for voluntary liquidation. And it is only the voluntary liquidation action when it goes there, but the end result, both with respect to when you come for resolution and resolution is not passed and a liquidation order is passed into section 33, results in the dissolution of the corporate person. Same result comes when you go for voluntary liquidation. That brings me to chapter 6, which, as I said, is with respect to the authority by which all these adjudicating authorities and the appellate tribunal gets the power to do so. Chapter 7 deals with the offences and the punishment and penalties in the event of the corporate debtor or their directors not disclosing there are frauds, etc., fraudulent transactions, preference transactions, and all these are dealt with in chapter 7. That brings me back now to go back to chapter 2 to deal with the position in relation to chapter 2 in little more detail for you. The object of this code is for maximization of the value of the assets in relation to the reorganization and the insolvency resolution. It promotes entrepreneurship, makes available credit, balances the interest of all stakeholders. Creditor under the code is meant a person to whom a debt is owed and includes a financial creditor, an operational creditor, both secured and unsecured, including a decree holder who may be holding a decree in its favor against the corporate person. Charge under the code is an interest created on the assets or the property of the corporate debtor, provided the condition is that the charge is registered in terms of section 77 of the Companies Act. I may hasten to add that general lien which we normally thought banks have over in every advance that they have given to the assets of their customers or their borrowers is not recognized under the code. We must make a distinction between, under the code, between a claim and a debt. Right to payment, whether reduced into judgment, disputed, undisputed, legal, even equitable, besides right to remedy breach of a contract under any law, if such breach gives right to payment, you all know section 73, 74 of the Contract Act, whether disputed or undisputed, all form part of the claim under the code. It's a very wide definition provided by the legislature. In contradiction to the claim, the debt under the code includes only financial and operational debt, which is owed and means a liability or an obligation by the corporate person to pay to the creditor, whether financial or operational. The code creates authorities. It has created a board which is called IBBI, which is vested with jurisdiction. Unlike many other statutes, it has jurisdiction to regulate the profession. It has jurisdiction on power to make regulation, therefore legislative. It also has jurisdiction to provide process even for the liquidation or, for that matter, resolution process. So it's a very powerful organ of the code, and I must, with all humility, say Dr. Sao, right from the day one when he took over, has taken a lead from the front along with his members of the board and takes steps to amend the regulations the moment a situation arises, unlike in many other statutes when we see years pass by when no amendment is made by the legislature or even for the government. Then brings the second institution that is created, which is by chartered accountants, for the time being cost accountants and company secretaries. Companies they have incorporated where the resolution professionals get membership and subject to their qualification provided again by the board. These are the institutions who are now in between the board and the resolution professionals. Prior to coming into force, or just immediately after coming into force, many of us thought that how will we meet this demand of this new legislature, a new code? But I am happy to share with you that each stakeholder, right from the legislature, the government, the chartered accountants, the lawyers, the senior counsel, company secretaries, they have collectively handled this statute, and the result is that India won the international award in 2018, beating Singapore, and stating that this was the most sought after jurisdiction, most recognized jurisdiction, and improved insolvency jurisdiction in the world. That was in 2018, and I'm sure we continue to hold that position in times to come. The code has 5 sets of rules, 15 sets of regulations made by IBBI before many orders passed by the government in removal of doubts. At the first place, many people during the course of its operation have been putting a question, especially as President of Insol India, I have to answer that, to say, why did we find this as a code? We only had a code of civil procedure. Why this insolvency and bankruptcy code? The answer is obvious. This is the first code which in fact not only incorporates the insolvency and bankruptcy provisions, it also amends, as I said earlier, 11 other acts, including Partnership Act, the Companies Act, and many other acts, which detailed are given in Schedule 1 to 11 of the code. That brings me to the next position and start with you how the code functions with respect to Part 2. In fact, right from 2016, it is Part 2 which is taking the field. It is Part 2 where insolvency regime has been invoked by before the Company Law Board or Company Law NCLT and the Educating Authority, and we have found petitions being filed both under Section 7. Section 7 can be invoked by a financial creditor for himself on behalf of every other financial creditor, and provided debt with respect to all of them is due and payable. An amendment was brought in, I'm sure most of you know, where we have not brought in the stakeholders like allottees of, with respect to JP, this started. The amendment has been made now, where we bring in now the allottees also as a financial creditor. Lot of this was challenged in the Supreme Court by the real estate agencies or companies, but the Supreme Court upheld in Pioneer Urban Land case, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutional validity of this provision, where an explanation recognizing a lottee as a real estate project having a commercial effect was made, and consequently now they form part of the financial creditor. Then comes a new amendment in 2020 in relation to those real estate financial creditors. And now provisos have been added either to have a numerical number of 100, or they should be at least 10% of the total number of allottees in the same class in the same real estate project. Therefore, numerical numbers have been given, or 10% in terms of the total number of people. This is, of course, subject to the total claim being over 1 crore, as we have seen that, which normally would be, because unless probably you're in a slum, the value of every plot or every flat is going to be over that. The amendment, however, this amendment has also been challenged in the Honorable Supreme Court, where status quo has been granted by the Supreme Court, but the amendment is operative, and the amendment with respect to this 10% of the total number of people, or 100 in number, holds a feed as of today. And there's no stay made by the Honorable Supreme Court with respect to any of these. Post Section 7, where the financial creditor invokes the jurisdiction of the NCLT or the adjudicating authority, brings me to the next category of creditors, namely operational creditor, which attracts Section 8 and 9. Unlike Section 7, where we saw once the default is committed and evidence of that default or repayment schedule is given as evidence in the petition, no condition is laid down for a notice in writing from the financial creditor unto the corporate debtor. But for an operational creditor, in order to have the invoking Section 8 and 9, it has to give a notice in writing. The forms are prescribed now under Section Form 3 and 4 of the regulations, and once that notice is given to the corporate debtor or the corporate person, they get 10 days time to file a response, either to say that a dispute is already pre-existing between the parties with respect to the said operational debt, or a matter is pending in a civil court, or an arbitration. An interesting question may arise that after the Commercial Courts Act, which has come into operation in 2015 Act, where under Section 12, a conciliation, or what we call is mediation actually, not conciliation. Many of us are getting confused between conciliation and mediation, is made compulsory. Limitation stops. Now, question would be, can you institute an insolvency proceeding under Section 8 and 9, read with Section 9, when a conciliation or a mediation is pending in terms of a Commercial Court Act? Normally speaking, if the law, as I said, Section 238 of Code overrides every other law. But please look at it from the new concept that is developing, namely the mediation. It's making inroads in almost every law. And today we have about 19 statutes where mediation is provided compulsory. I am not referring to conciliation once again, unlike which is in Industrial Disputes Act or in Part 3 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. The question, therefore, one day the court will have to examine this. I'm sure the adjudicating authority or the Supreme Court or the appellate tribunal will examine this issue, that if a mediation is pending, which is a condition precedent under the Commercial Courts Act, can you do this and initiate insolvency proceedings? And would that not be a relevant factor if the corporate debtor was to respond to it and place that material before the adjudicating authority? In fact, a question did arise in relation to a Micro Development Act, and the court said the adjudicating authority will look into the question as to whether the corporate person has actually raised dispute before the word used is conciliation, under the conciliation, and consequently will take a decision before admitting the petition. But the question is, a mediation is a confidential. There's a confidentiality involved. What were the disputes? It could be still set out, but what were the proposals given to each other would not be a subject matter that could be disclosed before the adjudicating authority for it to take a decision whether it's a case fit to allow the mediation to continue or to admit the petition. But experience shows that though under the law, the provision provided is 14 days time to the adjudicating authority to admit or reject a petition, but most of the time has been taken is over 6 months also, where the petitions are pending. So I'm sure this provision of utilization of mediation, especially in relation to operational creditors, would be given its due prominence by the adjudicating authority, keeping in view the principles of Section 442 of the Companies Act, where also mediation already forms part of the Companies Act. And after all, NCLT is constituted, as I said, under the Companies Act, with a jurisdiction given under the court to adjudicate with relation to, or not really adjudicate, it's really approval of the resolution plan or to pass a liquidation order if approval of the plan is not there. So one will have to wait and see how the adjudicating authorities deal with the provisions with relation to mediation in relation to Commercial Courts Act. The third insolvency initiation, as I said earlier, can be by the corporate debtor himself under Part 2. But this is distinct from the voluntary liquidation, for he says, I am in default of a debt, whether operational or financial, and I would like a resolution process to begin with respect to me. The amendment to that has now brought in, there was a lot of confusion with respect to the same, whether you need to have a shareholders, a special resolution or not. An amendment has been brought into Section 10, where a special resolution is not necessitated to move to the NCLT or adjudicating authority. This relates to default of debt, both financial or operational, as I said. Now, financial debt normally would be in relation to loans advanced or what we call consideration, time for value. But operational debt would be where you are using it for operational means. That means from the funds given by banks or financial entities, you have utilized them from taking capital goods, or you have utilized the finance for the purpose of working capital and actually buying your goods and services by use of that capital. I'll deal with that once I'm dealing with the question in relation to the distinction between the two creditors while dealing with the resolution plan. Section 11 prohibits a person from initiating the insolvency process under Section 10 if there's already an order and is undergoing a resolution process or liquidation process or insolvency process, or has not completed 12 months prior to the proceeding of making of the application for corporate debt of the corporate debtor, or has violated the financial, if it's a case of financial creditor, has violated the terms of any resolution plan which was approved 12 months before the making of the application under this chapter for initiation of the corporate insolvency, or by a corporate debtor in respect of whom liquidation order has already been passed, as I said, order in Section 33 or under the voluntary liquidation. A clarification has been made by the amendment again here. For earlier it was felt that a corporate person cannot institute insolvency proceedings under Section 8 and 9 of the Insolvency Act. That has been clarified by an amendment which says that a corporate person is also entitled to invoke that jurisdiction, and in fact a decision of the appellate tribunal under the code in the SN Plumbing Private Limited, where a corporate debtor was wanting to initiate insolvency proceedings under Section 7 or 9, the court has clarified that it will be entitled to do so. Two judgments or two decisions are relevant for me to place them before you right here. One is with respect to Mr. Ravinder Kumar Reddy, where a question was a payment of rent under a registered lease agreement. The court, with all respect, took a view that that's not a debt, that's not an operational debt within the meaning of the court and consequently rejected that petition. I'm sure in times to come this will be rectified. For you would recall when service tax came, the same was challenged, and one had the privilege to go to the Government of India as Additional Solicitor General. And the court, Justice Deepak Mishra, then presiding, held that letting out a commercial premises was a service rendered to a tenant. And if that is the ambit of law, then what wonders why would it not fall within the ambit of the operational debt? But that's the position as of today. I do not know how the adjudicating authorities will view it tomorrow, or maybe the Honorable Supreme Court rectifies it. The second judgment is with respect to India Bulls. And this judgment is relevant only for the purpose of saying that no, notwithstanding that you may have security, you may claim an interest in the property or an asset of the corporate debtor. But if the same is not registered under Section 77 of the Companies Act, then you may be a financial creditor, but you would not be a secured financial creditor within the ambit of the court. So the fine distinction has been made that though you remain a financial creditor, maybe you have lent money, but your charge is not registered under 77, and consequently your security, insofar as that is concerned, would not be recognized under the court. Now, once these petitions are filed, whether under 7, 8, 9, or 10, the adjudicating authority gets the jurisdiction to start the proceedings. The statute gives them, the court gives them 14 days time to look at, admit it or reject it. But as I said earlier, experience shows that in many cases we have even taken more than 6 months to decide this issue. Consequently, the said provision of 14 days is directory and not mandatory. For nothing is mandatory for the court. Most of you who are practicing civil law would know that there is a provision under the CPC that a judgment will be pronounced in a particular time. This has been hardly followed and been violated more with the immunity than otherwise. The moment admission takes place after 14 days or whatever time, Section 14 of the code triggers in, and by which a moratorium gets declared. An order has to be passed, and that order is passed only after following the principles of natural justice, which is no provision under the code. But in practice, once an insolvency petition is preferred, the same has to be given, copy has to be served on the corporate debtor, who is entitled to file a response, and the adjudicating authority then hears both sides before passing the order of admission under Section 14 and declaring moratorium. And now with the amendment to appoint an interim resolution professional or a resolution professional, as the case may be. We have presently 15 benches of the adjudicating authority in all over the country, doing with the insolvency and the company's provisions. And we also have 2 benches now of the appellate tribunal, one at New Delhi and one at Chennai, now started functioning. The moment an order of moratorium is passed under Section 14, everything comes to a standstill. The management gets changed immediately. The board of directors gets suspended, and the IRP or the RP, resolution professional as the case may be, takes over the management of the corporate person. And with that, he is entitled to collect all assets, collate them, all transactions, look at them, and proceed further. And moment this order gets passed, a public notice gets issued so that people at large come to know that insolvency process has begun for a particular corporate person, so that those who have any claims against the corporate debtor are entitled to file their claims with the professional, which is resolution professional, and the resolution professional is entitled to look into those claims and verify them, looking at the records of the corporate debtor, and come to a conclusion whether the claims are genuine, claims are to what extent to be allowed, and claims to what extent would be considered for the purpose of rehabilitation of or resolution of the corporate debtor. RP is another. Resolution Professional is one of the most important institutions that we have created. We all know under the 1956 Act, it was very rare that parties would agree, the debtor or the creditor, to appoint a particular liquidator. And it was mostly an administrator that was appointed with the consent of the parties. But here under the code, a statute provides that an insolvency professional, which is registered with one of the agencies that I told you, created. Unfortunately, the Bar Council of India, though I made a representation, did not think of making a subsidiary of their own so that lawyers could register themselves in insolvency professionals under them. So most of lawyers who are now insolvency professionals are actually registered with one of the subsidiaries made by companies, secretary, or the chartered accountants, or the cost accountants. Be that it may, the resolution professional, by virtue of the statutory power vested in him, takes over the management of the company and looks after the affairs of the company, manages the affairs, appoints, dismisses, enters into arrangement, and works as if he is the board of directors of the corporate person. Once claims are made, he collates everything. The next step comes is a committee of creditors gets established under this code. And that committee of creditors is by financial institutions. Now, of course, the allottees of the project would also have time to be on the committee of creditors. Welcome Vadwa, welcome Mr. Ankur, welcome Ms. Bharat Arora. One of the questions that you are putting in between to me is that if claim is, what is the remedy if claim is not filed during the time granted, where the claim gets extinguished, unless the company goes into liquidation, then you get another right to come back post liquidation and file your claim with the liquidator. Therefore, it's very important for all persons who have claims against the corporate debtor to ensure that within the timelines granted by ERP, claims are filed with the resolution professional, who is given with all documents, with all particulars, so that the claim can be recognized. The remedy, as far as code is concerned, is not provided. Of course, there is a condonation which you can seek from the NCLT, but in many cases this has been declined by the court unless they find that there were circumstances beyond your control, beyond the control of the claimant to make that claim to the court, to the RP. It is, however, possible that where you have not made a claim, but you may be a person who must be making a strategic supply or services to the corporate debtor. So ultimately, whosoever is the resolution applicant ultimately may enter into a separate transaction with you. Satisfying your claim is a different question altogether. But under the code, if your claim has not been filed, not verified by the resolution professional, your claim gets distinguished in law. That brings me to the next part, that once the committee of creditors is constituted of all financial creditors, and now of course the allottees also, a large question arose. One of the questions that arose was, with the large allottees in projects, how many people can be accommodated? So the question there was that you will probably elect one of the, or one or two persons who will then be representing the allottees in the committee of directors. That seems to be the position with respect to the same. The effect of section 14 order, as I said, would be that no recovery proceedings can be initiated. The pending proceedings come to a standstill. No foreclosure can be done. And by the amendment being made now, the governments are not entitled to, or persons are not entitled to, even suspend or even terminate the existing contracts with the corporate debtor with respect to anything and everything. In Vodafone, one of the questions that arose was, government was one of the partners with Vodafone in one of their where they used to have petroleum products, and government claimed that it had profit sharing business, and the profits have not been paid by Vodafone to them. Consequently, they directed during the CIRP process that you should give all this money to the government. This was challenged by RP, and the court said, government or no government, no claim can have preference, and you cannot instruct or give any such directions to the RP for during the CIRP process. The moratorium also provides that the essential services and supplies to the corporate debtor now under CIRP process shall neither be terminated nor suspended. We have seen this in one of the power companies where the government was the sole purchaser. It tried to terminate the set contract. The adjudicating authority intervened and said it will not be possible with respect to do so, a case in Gujarat. However, under Section 14 moratorium order, there are exceptions. The government can always say a particular transaction will not be allowed to be fall within the ambit of by a notification issued by the government. And another aspect is the contract of guarantee, which guarantee is given by an individual or a corporate person for guaranteeing the debt owed to a financial creditor or an operational creditor. Well, to ask to Mohapatra to say that you have to provide your bona fides, obviously the adjudicating authority, when you file a petition under Section 10, would look into it. If you already have debt payable, committed a default, the assets of the corporate debtor are not sufficient to meet ultimately the corporate debtor claim made thereunder, then the choice would be nothing else but to accept it, unless the adjudicating authority finds that you have brought Section 10 petition for an ulterior motive, then obviously the petition will be dismissed. Now, the question of director having resigned or not resigned would not be relevant here. That is not relevant for the purpose of the insolvency proceedings or what we call CIRP process. The fact is, whether you were ex-director is not relevant. Whosoever claimed they were directors of the board on the date when Section 4 is passed gets suspended and RP takes over the management of the company. So far as RERA is concerned, as I said, that the Supreme Court has already ruled that RERA, Consumer Protection Act, must be harmoniously read with IBC. But the question today is, if 238 has to prevail, if there is inconsistency between any of the three laws, then obviously code will prevail, neither RERA nor Consumer Protection Act. But if the 10 months have passed, an application to Section 9 of the IBC before NCT, the remedy would be to file a petition if nothing is happening, and if the adjudicating authority finds that the default is continuing, obviously it will admit a petition and Section 9 will follow. As I was saying, a guarantor is also excluded under Section 14, and as I will deal with it a little later, time permits, that the guarantor now of a corporate debtor is now dealt with under the chapter under Part 3, which has now been brought in force with effect from 1st December 2019, where you can bring in resolution as well as bankruptcy proceedings against the individual so far as guarantors are concerned. Then comes the question with respect to what happens. The corporate debtor's entire transaction is then looked in by RP, and he makes a memorandum of information memorandum under the code and the regulations. He makes this to make it enable the resolution applicants who would like to put in their might who may like to bring their finances into the company and take management of the company, ultimately, if the plan is approved. Consequently, this is taken care of by a memorandum of information. Once the memorandum of information is made, there is a certain portion of that memorandum which will be confidential, which the resolution professional may not like to share with everybody. Consequently, what he does is that he includes, when he starts this process, he invites the claim, goes to and makes an information memorandum, and then invites applications for interest, whosoever is interested to participate in the management or whosoever wants to take over this corporate data. So if one resolution applicant shows his interest, complies with what he has asked for, resolution professional, then access is made of that confidential information also of the corporate data, which can be shared with it to enable them to file a resolution plan in terms of the court. A question had been raised to me during this time of COVID-19, whether a force majeure clause was not incorporated into the resolution plan approved by a adjudicating authority, and the resolution applicant now has his inability to comply with the terms of the resolution plan. But the question today is, force majeure has to be a part of a resolution plan that you follow. But I am sure, keeping in view the trend of judgments that Bombay and Delhi has taken, where they have looked at it, force majeure, as an extraordinary circumstance and feels equities flow into it, whether equities would be relevant or not in insolvency is a question that one will have to look at later on in probably times to come. These are questions that were put to me also on the Facebook, and consequently I thought I must deal with them there itself. Force majeure has to be a part of a contract. Force majeure's wordings becomes important. Therefore, unless the resolution applicant puts it into his resolution plan, which I am sure drafters, all those who are drafting resolution plans, must be taking care of it, that of course nobody thought COVID-19 will come, but in India we have been having all kinds of influenzas, all kinds of scares are coming in. Therefore, there could be possibility of roids now. That is the latest trend that we find happening even as close as Delhi. So consequently, if force majeure clause, if it is part of the resolution applicant, duly approved by the adjudicating authority, it may become relevant. The only other way is that if you can go and file an application before the adjudicating authority. But I must warn my friends, the power of review is not with the adjudicating authority to review its orders. Consequently, it will be difficult. Yes, the remedy ultimately will be Supreme Court of India, which may come to your aid and say, this COVID-19 was never thought of, nobody dreamt of it, and consequently, there are special circumstances where we may allow a resolution plan to be amended, but that will depend on the Supreme Court of India. I do not think it will fall within the jurisdiction of the adjudicating authority, or for that matter, the appellate jurisdiction, to incorporate into an existing resolution plan, which is approved already by the adjudicating authority. But a word of caution must be brought in. Those plans which are today pending adjudication, pending approval, it will be for the resolution applicant to move the adjudicating authority, request the adjudicating authority to remand the resolution plan back to the Committee of Creditors in terms of Section 31, so that, in Section 30, sorry, so that the Committee of Creditors can look at this and allow the resolution applicant to add to the existing resolution plan a force majeure clause. On one hand, the resolution professional is looking at management, running as a going concern, the corporate person, bringing new employees, asking for claims, assisting the committee of creditors, calls for resolution plans, and now starts verifying the resolution plans to place them before the committee of creditors for its approval. In terms of the mandate of the court, a resolution professional has to go through each plan and finding it in conformity with the code and the necessary necessary ingredients thereof. Especially, for example, how does the resolution applicant wants to pay the debt? How does it want to run? What is its future plans? From where will it get funds? What is its stature? All that must be provided in the plan. And it must have a mechanism within it. How does the resolution applicant wants to implement the plan if approved by the committee of creditors and ultimately by the adjudicating authority? So a lot of responsibility has been cast on the resolution professional. When the resolution plan passes through the first phase, it goes before the committee of creditors. Committee of creditors then looks at it. It looks at its feasibility, looks at its viability, looks at it how best it is, and takes a business decision in its own discretion to say that such a plan is worth considering and approves the same by 66% of them. Consequently, I would have to rush it up, for I see time running out for me. So the resolution plan, once it is passed by the committee of creditors, then goes under section 31 to the adjudicating authority, which cannot look at the business decision of the committee of creditors. But I must add, committee of creditors cannot delegate this power to somebody else to look at the plans. It must do its job. Of course, committee of creditors can have its subcommittees and ratify their actions. So once the plan goes before the adjudicating authority then approves the said plan. The said plan becomes binding on everybody, whether it's the shareholder, whether it's the creditors, including the government, state and the central government and all local bodies. If the plan is not approved, a liquidation order passed into section 33, and once the liquidation order is passed, then section 53 gets attracted. But before that, the liquidator is entitled to again get an opportunity to sell the corporate debtor to a new person who would like to take over the management. I must add, looking at the time that I have, that section 29A has been a bone of contention, which disqualified many resolution applicants, including the erstwhile management or the promoters, from putting a resolution plan. Two amendments have been made. The financial entities who were earlier thought were also debarred, they were connected with the corporate debtor, have been clarified that they are exempted, and people who have taken a corporate debtor under a resolution or with the approval of the Reserve Bank of India under various schemes or with the order of the court are also exempted now and do not fall within section 29A. I may hasten to add 29A bar to the erstwhile promoters and directors starts from the fact that they can't make a resolution plan, goes right up to the end. Even during liquidation, they cannot have assets under the sale by liquidator also, and consequently the liquidator then proceeds to sell the assets of the corporate debtor, and on the recovery of money then it distributes it in terms of 53. I must add here, at the first time in this code that the waterfall has been provided where government dues are less than on clause D and do not form part of the priority. The first priority is the cost that we are incurring with respect to the insolvency process or liquidation process. So the entire cost has to be set aside for meeting that cost. The second comes the workmen with the secured creditors and financial creditor. A secured creditor can opt out of it, but if he from the security that he has, if he sells that security, but there's a balance amount, then it goes in clause D of section 53 and does not claim to be a first creditor in terms with others. The third C category is other employees of the corporate debtor, and fourth comes the government along with the secured financial creditor for his balance debt. Therefore, there is a waterfall till we all thought that the normal impression that we carry that a sovereign debt will get priority. It is not getting any priority into the court. I would leave here and give some time for questions to be asked so that I may not lose the entire time in giving you my viewpoint only. Can I have the questions, please? Arvina, you are right. The threshold for the insolvency has been increased to 1 crore. But the same does not apply to an individual, because an individual does not come with respect to the same. Under the chapter 3 or part 3 of the code, the jurisdiction though is again looking at resolution repayment plan. It's not a resolution plan, it's a repayment plan under part 3. And if the repayment plan does not get passed, then you have then you have a plan, then you have made it bankrupt. Mr. Atul Butcher, I will have a fixed time and date for question answers. I have no problem in doing so. One of the questions asked is that IRP calls for information of assets and banks accounts from one of the directors. If the director omits to do so, then the director is bound to be proceeded against, and the RP is entitled to move the adjudicating authority to compel him to do so. Non-giving this part forms part of part 7 if he was to withhold some information. Now, so far as the corporate debtor is concerned, there is no bar under section 14. Any proceedings for recovery on behalf of the corporate debtor can continue. In fact, we have a case around where a question arose was an arbitration was pending. The court took the view, the NCLT or the adjudicating authority, that since the execution will come much later, the arbitration may continue because there are claims and counterclaims which forms an integral part of the transaction. So the arbitration was allowed to continue, though there was a claim against the corporate debtor. There is no bar under section 14 of the code for the RP to continue those proceedings which are pending and continue all legal proceedings on behalf of the corporate debtor. In the question in respect to RERA, if the execution has been filed, then one has to move the RERA. It can't be a ground to move the insolvency court. Even if therefore, you may have a remedy to come under section Article 227 of the Constitution of the High Court to compel the RERA to pass an order in execution. But that can't be a ground for coming and invoking the jurisdiction under the code. I think I would thank you all for giving me this opportunity. Have an excellent weekend. If there are any questions, I'll be willing to, you may please send them by email to me. I will certainly like to answer them and look forward for many more opportunities to be amongst you. We will have discussions, interact with respect to the same. I want to inform all of you that we are already looking at Insol India to come out with specific topics to help you and help people to look at it. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Good evening. Thank you.